Greetings, everybody. Welcome to session 4, and thank you for joining me um, in an asynchronous pre-recorded session. I have a meeting at SCO for the other instructors the same time as our session would be held. So I asked Kelly Daly if it'd be okay if I recorded this for you all, and she said yes. So you will find this, or you found this, I should say, in Canvas. And everything that you'll need for this course is there in Canvas in session 4. So periodically, as we go through here, I will have you, I will cue you to pause the Zoom and do something on your own so that you'll be prepared at the end for the formative assessment. So anyway, let's get started. I'm going to share my screen, and if you want to follow along with your slide deck, again, it's in session 4. All right, so what we're doing today is focusing on writing to learn, and this is a really important domain in literacy. And if you're not an English teacher, it can be one that sort of is not necessarily front and center in your class. But I'm going to make an argument that it really is helpful to get students to write so that they are processing what they learn. And I have this as, using writing as the ultimate reading strategy. And I would say reading, we could also say that as the ultimate learning strategy. Okay. So our agenda for tonight, we're going to go over the lesson objectives. Why should we write? We will, I'm going to be sharing some tips with you because I know not all of you are language arts teachers. Quite a few of you are, which is very different from previous cohorts. And it's exciting for me, but there are quite a few that are not English language arts teachers. So I want to give you some tips and strategies. I'm not going to just assume that you're comfortable with teaching writing. So some of this, if you are an English language arts teacher, hopefully you'll find it helpful, but I don't know that it'll be something that it's going to be like, oh, that's brand new to me. And then the Canvas formative assessment will be at the end. So our learning objectives for tonight, we're going to examine why writing is so important to the learning process. I'm going to make that argument for you, why it's so important. And we will be looking at writing to learn tips and strategies. Again, that idea of writing, why writing, so that students can learn, so they can process the information and take that information and put it into their long-term memory, add it to their schema. We're going to be identifying the components of the writing process again, so I can teach you how to teach writing. It's a mini little lesson, if you will, and then how to incorporate writing into your subject area. So if you're teaching math, you're teaching chemistry, that you, besides maybe just a lab report, let's say, or besides just answering a word problem, the answer to a word problem in a full sentence, maybe getting your students to think about writing beyond that. And then we will be looking at a variety of writing genres, persuasive, informative, descriptive, those kinds of writing genres and their purposes, why we have these different genres, and the impact on the audience depending on the genre. So we've got quite a few universal TPEs that we address, so I'm just going to click through those slides and just get right into it. So writing, but I'm not an English teacher. And I know that now with the Common Core standards, I'm hearing this less from people because literacy across the curriculum is the focus. And we all are in this together, all of us subject area teachers. So just because you're not an ELA teacher or an ELD teacher, you still need to incorporate writing. So a little bit of a statistic here, research study conducted by the Leadership and Learning Center found that approximately 25% of students scored proficient or higher on state assessments in schools where writing and note-taking were rare in science classes. So not a great, only 25% of the students score proficient or higher, where writing and note-taking weren't. And again, we got science. We're not talking even about English classes. By contrast, in schools where science teachers required writing and note-taking, 79% of students scored at the proficient level. Okay, big difference. And I'm going to assume that if the science teachers are requiring writing and note-taking, that school-wide teachers are doing the same. So students are being encouraged to write and to learn through writing in a variety of subjects. And then writing matters hugely, says Schmoker. All right. So the very act of writing deepens thought and active engagement with the content. And when we talked about reading in session 1 or session 2 and session 3, teaching reading, really one of the keys with reading and reading comprehension is active engagement. It is not a passive pursuit, reading. The mind is active. And with writing requires the mind to be active. It requires deep thought and active engagement with the content. And therefore, ergo, learning, right? So as students write, they construct meaning around the content. They make connections and they discover what they do and do not know. Okay? This idea of constructing meaning and making connections, that's where the learning happens. That's where the deep learning happens. And they also realize, maybe, I think just as important as what they know, what they don't know, where they have some gaps in their understanding. Writing is a tool for learning. It's fundamental to acquiring thinking about, and communicating knowledge in all disciplines, right? So in all disciplines is, again, a key phrase here. It's a tool for learning in all disciplines, okay? And because of its value as a formative assessment, and that's what we're going to talk about more tonight for sure, its value as a formative assessment, writing should never be solely used as a summative assessment. Rather, writing is a powerful vehicle for teachers to provide students with feedback and encouragement to further explore a topic and revisit their ideas. So, formative assessment. And then let me just frame this again in how I see formative assessment. Formative assessment informs. It informs the teacher where the student is, but more importantly, it informs the student where he or she is. So when a student is writing, again, kind of going up to this, it's a tool for learning. They understand what they do. It's the first bullet. They understand what they do and do not know. Okay, so that's the formative assessment piece of this. Right. So what we're going to be talking about tonight, particularly in the world of formative assessment, is writing that is what we call low stakes, that it's not a big essay at the end of the grading period, at the end of the term. It's not a term paper, though you can use writing for that. But it's quick little things like exit tickets. It's a do now at the beginning of a class. It's as you're teaching, and I don't know if I've really mentioned this before to you guys, but the best way of teaching is what we call a chunk and chew, so that we teach for about 10 minutes, and then we, if we're direct teaching, and then we allow our students about 2 minutes to process the information. And writing is a great way to get them to process that information that you've been teaching them. All right, so an example of a formative assessment that could be used across the curriculum is this first-person summary narrative, where students retell events or a process, like say in science, from an imagined personal perspective. So it's got some creativity. It's kind of fun. So, for instance, in social studies, students could write dramatic narratives based on historical facts pertinent to the Battle of Alamo. So they could take on a persona and they would retell the story of the Battle of Alamo, for instance. And certainly you would know whether they knew it or not by could they do that. Science could be, if you've been studying volcanoes, a day in my life as a volcano. Right? Again, very much a formative assessment where you'd be able to know, as with the student, do they understand what goes on with a volcano? If in PE or health, the effects of exercise written from the perspective of a heart or a pair of lungs. So the summary narrative is versatile, it's motivational, and it requires students to process and make sense of expository text. So after they've read this, this text that has explained something to them, now they have to summarize it, which actually is really a high order thinking skill to summarize, because they have to decide what's most important. They have to put it in some sort of order, and then to have them tell it through a certain perspective, it makes it creative and kind of fun. And students have loved this. So if we're going to take a look in your reading in the content area book, okay, strategy number 24, which is what we call the raft strategy, and you will find it on pages 158 to 160. All right, and to do an activity like this, we need to regularly assign these. This is just, it should be happening on a fairly regular basis. And I'm going to be providing you with a plethora of writing to learn activities that are in our book here. So the raft strategy, let's take a look at it. So you're going to turn to page 158 through 160 in your text. You'll read about the strategy. I want you to look over the assignment examples on page 160, and then create an outline for a raft assignment for your students to use tomorrow or soon in class. And actually, this is going to be your formative assessment for tonight. So you're going to create a raft assignment, okay, where you you let your students know what their role is going to be. They're going to be speaking from what role, who their audience is, the format of that they're going to be writing in, and the topic of what they're going to be writing. Okay, so I'm going to have you pause the Zoom here for a moment and take a look, read over those 2 pages, and yeah. So I'm going to just put this on like this. So take a look, pause the video. All right, so welcome back. You have taken a look at the raft assignment. I hope it's given you some inspiration. Unfortunately, with how we're doing tonight's class, we're not going to do the piece that I really enjoy doing, and that would have been to get you into a breakout group and share your raft assignment with colleagues. We don't have that opportunity doing it this asynchronous Zoom, but that would be a way of, kind of hearing what other people are up to. If you've got other teachers at your school that are in your cohort, although I don't think we have anybody who's maybe at CASA. Anyway, it's a cool thing to hear what other people are doing, even if they're not in your subject area. All right. So we're going to kind of switch into this idea, continue with writing to learn. And I really like this little graphic I have here, a quote by Flannery O'Connor, who was a Southern writer, Southern American writer. and who said, she said, I write because I don't know what I think until I read what I say. And I think this is the, as an English teacher, I can tell you, I know this to be true, reading some of my students' writing, where I will watch them discover what they think in their writing. Unfortunately, that's not really what you want. That's more of what a rough draft will do. But convincing students that the first thing that they write is not their final is, can be a kind of a tough sell for some of them. But you can see them write themselves into an aha and they finally get it. But what we want to do is have, kind of the pre-writing and the drafting allows them to kind of realize what they think and what they want to say, and then they can say it. All right. So with our, let me see, with our writing to learn activities, they're informal writing tasks like the raft, for instance, that help students think through key concepts or ideas that were presented in class. Okay. And these writing to learn are different from essays or reports or themes because they're exploratory. The purpose is to reflect on what's been learned. Okay, so again, these are formative. These are low stakes kind of writing. These are not the essays and that kind of thing. These are just kind of exploratory writing, like free writes. So they help students develop parameters around what they've learned. It helps them make the learning meaningful. It helps them make personal connections between what they're learning and their own life. And those personal connections for teenagers are so important, right? And that makes the learning relevant for them, and then they remember it. So giving them these opportunities to write to learn can be really helpful. And also to take some of the scariness out of writing. I think part of why students fear writing or don't like to write is because they feel judged. Because often writing is this high stakes end of the unit kind of endeavor, and that gets scary. We don't like to be judged, and if we don't feel as if we're strong writers, it can really be difficult. So the more we can get them to develop fluency, where they just feel comfortable and they are willing to make mistakes and to explore, that's where we want our students to be. And we need to model that too. So some of these writing assignments, I would highly recommend you do them along with your student. So the raft that you created in the formative assessment, you're going to be writing your assignment, right? You're going to be the student. You've created the assignment, teacher, in the last slide, but now you're going to write to answer that or to respond to the raft. I think it's, and I've mentioned this before, I think this is really a powerful technique. I don't know if you would call it technique, but it's a powerful way of approaching your assignments. In advertising, it's called dog fooding, where you actually do what you would assign, your students to do. And it does a couple things. It allows you to see, and I'm sure I've mentioned this to you before, but it allows you to see, where the holes are, maybe what hasn't been really well explained, or the directions aren't clear. So it allows you to see those things, and then also gives you a model to share with your students. You have your own writing, and it shows kind of an element of vulnerability for you as the teacher to share your writing, and students appreciate that. So jump in there and do the kind of exploratory writing right along with your students. All right, I have a video here that shows how low stakes writing is used in a school. This video is from Edutopia. So let me get this going for us.
want you to do right now is in your notebook, write down at least one thing you know and one thing you don't, or one question you have. Because we do low stakes writing, I have seen my students become more critical thinkers. I've seen them become less afraid to make mistakes. They're pushing each other and themselves to think about things a little more deeply. All right, ladies and gents, we're going to start our writing. Begin.
In every class, pretty much every day, you will find kids writing.
We write in English, science. Actually, no, we write in every single class.
We do writing daily here in our math class. We use writing to put down our ideas and where we're at so far and where we can go from there.
So jot down what it is that you're looking for, because that can kind of be like the question that you're trying to answer, you know?
In numeracy, in history, in English, in art. You'll see them writing thoughts, writing opinions, giving people comments.
I had a student once say to me, I never write because I'm always wrong. He'd gone through all of elementary school and he was really used to a lot of red marks crossing out his misspelled words. For us, you don't have to have mastered spelling before you can think deeply about a novel or a play. We're going to do a lot of low stakes writing where, you know what? I don't care necessarily about the spelling. Here's an interesting issue. Here's an interesting problem. Let's just think about that on paper for 2 minutes.
Describe or write about 2 things that you can do to improve your group's work today. Structure is obviously so important to a piece of writing, but if you start with the structure, then you limit the ideas that you come up with. Whatever statement you're focusing on, you can write any notes that you think will be helpful for later. We're working on argument right now. The 6 steps. They did a little bit of research on 2 different topics. Should homework be banned? And do schools need to have a police presence? We're going to start our writing. We have 7 minutes. Begin. We use 7-minute writes close to daily for a couple of reasons. It's an idea generator. Like if you only have 7 minutes, it's just about like getting out a bunch of ideas.
I think that schools should be provided with cops only if they have a taser, handcuffs, and a club.
Definitely important to me that they're sharing it right away so that they can teach each other to be better writers.
And with that, I agree that we shouldn't have homework because we have other things to do at home. For example, since I translate, I am busy and my body gets really stressed. The 7-minute write, which I really like because that gives me time to just like spill out all my thinking and like I don't have time to stop and rethink. Your writing is not always going to be perfect. You just have to pour out all your thoughts at first and then refix it later.
Don't forget to write down your observations. What do you see? What do you notice?
In 7th grade science class, we use interactive notebooks. With the interactive notebook, they are essentially writing their own middle school textbook. And low stakes writing is integral to the notebook. As we go through the year, we do an input and an output.
How many hydrogen, carbon, oxygen?
And the input is generally class notes, which are very, very, very structured at the beginning of the year. And the output is always reflecting on it or doing your own version of it or doing diagrams to explain it. So on one side, it's in academic language, and on the other side, it is in their own language.
It helps me like start to put stuff in my own words, not have to get help all the time, and then be independent.
We've been learning about molecules and atoms and mass and stuff. So it's like you understand it yourself. So now you can explain it in your own words. For my revision, I said atoms make up everything and that has mass and stored. Atoms does not make up everything.
Love it.
Atoms make up mass and build and like use it to build.
The low stakes writing is part of the instruction itself. It's writing to learn, not to show what you already learned.
You get a student-generated definition or a student-generated answer, which everyone in the class can then learn from.
Wait, what did you read? Chemical bonds are so skinny and they hold mass.
Low stakes writing is the way of valuing student voice and student ideas, and it has carryover into all different areas. It will foster better discussions. It will foster more thought. It will foster engagement of everyone in the room.
Our parents might ask, why do we stay up so late? It's because of homework.
Some pretty impressive young people there, and an impressive writing program that you see being instituted across the curriculum. I love that example, the science journal, and that idea that they're writing to learn. They're not writing to show they're learning. They're writing to learn. So to make what they're learning, stick. So anyway, I would love for you to take a moment now and either jot down some thoughts about what you just saw in kind of a free write we talk about chunk and chew, for you to chew this a little bit and process, and how might you be able to use more kind of writing opportunities in your class, more low stakes writing opportunities to allow your students to kind of process information. So I'm going to just give you a couple minutes to do that, to think about it, and then you can pause the video, and then we will continue on with the next part of this. All right. Hopefully you found you had some time to just kind of think about this and how it might impact your classroom in your teaching. All right. So let me get this into slideshow again. So let's talk about some ways to develop writing to learn topics for your classroom. How can you make this happen? Again, for some people, this is already a part of your culture in your classroom. For others, this might be a learning opportunity and a growth opportunity for you. So keep assignments short, right? These are low stakes, these are experimental, and you saw an example in the video, 7 minutes. And you may want to start, with less than that. You may want to start like 3 minutes, giving them a 3-minute writing opportunity. And then work it up to say 7 minutes, but make these short. Expect creative thinking and exploration of the content. Share expectations with the students. Ask them to write about what the topic means to them, is an example. You could also do something called what we call a brain dump. Write down everything you remember about what you just saw or what I just explained to you. Okay, and then they can share that with another student. That's another way of doing this. If you could have identify the intended audience ahead of time about, you're going to write to a 3rd grader and explain to them what we just learned about the Constitution, or what we just learned about covalent bonds, or something along those lines. So you can give them an audience ahead of time, let's say. And this other piece is display student writing. Put it up there. You don't have to have the students' names up, but a representation of all levels of quality in the classroom. Students tend to write more carefully when they think that there's an audience other than the teacher that's going to be reading it. They're if they think their peers are going to be taking a look at it. So having a bulletin board where you're displaying student writing is a great idea. And then the other piece you could do is just have them share with each other, as we saw in the video, where they're reading aloud to an elbow partner what they wrote. Okay, and then it allows the other student to hear what someone else thought, or what they wrote down. Okay. Whoops, that is not what I wanted to do. Here we go. Let's do this. Actually, let me get back into slideshow. Okay, sorry about that. All right. So, varying the types of writing that you're asking students to do is a great idea. And I'm going to give you a couple examples here. We're linked a couple of different writing to learn activities here, the learning log and the written conversations. So they could do, as you saw, a learning log entry, like the science, they were doing that. They could do an analogy. So we just studied this concept. What does it remind you of? Can you create an analogy? Can you create a poem or an editorial or a letter to the textbook publisher or a letter to a friend? There's all different kinds of ways that you can get them to be writing different kind of tasks. So let's take a look at the learning log here. So I'm going to give you a minute to just read this on your own, and I'm going to scroll down after a second so that you can see the whole thing. All right. If you're not done reading through this, just pause the Zoom and continue with the reading the learning log example. But again, it's a great writing opportunity to include in your class on a regular basis, as I said, right? Maybe every day, every other day, a couple times a week. But it's a great thing to do as a do now activity when students enter the classroom. You can give them prompts, or as an exit ticket type of activity. Although if it's a learning log entry, probably they're not going to be turning it into you. It will be something, or they could, and then you hand it back to them and they put it into a binder. You can kind of decide how you want to manage it in your classroom. But they're a great opportunity for students to write and learn. Okay, and then we'll do the written conversations, and I'll do the same here where I'll scroll this. This is from NCTE, National Council of Teachers of English. So facilitating participation with silent conversations. It's basically like writing notes to each other, but with a learning, with learning as the focus. Okay, so if you read, the research basis, and then the strategy and practice, and again, I'll scroll down and let you read silently. Okay, if you're not done, just pause the video, pause the Zoom, and then finish reading. This is also, again, you can always click on these links in the slide deck and take a look at also if you need to give it more time on your own. Okay, so let me get here. All right. So, encourage students to interact with their reading assignments by summarizing key points, clarifying confusing material, asking questions about the material, recording observations over time, defining key terms. These are all things that they can do, things you can ask students to do after they've read material, so that one of the important things that we talked about in our last session with reading to learn is the importance of giving students time to reflect on what they've read. That reflection piece is really key, and writing is such a natural extension for that reflection. And it then also, there's an element of accountability in the reflection, because you could potentially either collect it or you can have students share with another student. So the reflection isn't just all in the head, right? And then to kind of go back to Flannery O'Connor's statement that maybe they don't even realize what they think about it until they write it. Okay, so it's a great practice here. Oh, I did it again. That is not what I need to do. I apologize for this, you guys. Let me get back into slideshow. I need to just stay. I'm using my mouse and that's what's popping it. Okay. Now I'm asking you to do, daily, if not daily, every other day writing with your students. But okay, now, some of you are like, I'm not an English teacher, and the paper load and the grading. So here's some ideas for that. You don't have to grade every single assignment. In fact, you shouldn't be. And if these are low stakes writing, they're not graded per se. You might give credit for it, a small amount of credit, but that's not the point of it, is to get graded. You can also use a rubric so that you don't have to, you're not marking every comma, or in fact, again, the low stakes writing, you shouldn't even be really worried about their spelling and their grammar and that kind of thing. It's to get their thinking down on paper. You can take it to the next step where you have them begin to proofread it or edit it and proofread it in some way to make it publishable. And we'll talk more about that in a little bit. They can polish their writing, but generally the writing to learn formative assessment pieces are not going to be, polished. But a rubric might, you can develop the rubric that talks about that it shows an engagement with the material, that and it demonstrates thinking, something along those lines. Okay, that's you can use feedback forms with familiar sentence starters, such as, I like what you said about, or when I read what you wrote, it reminded me of, or have you thought about, or I'd like to read more about your personal experience with. So you've already got these sort of written out, and then you just finish one of those or a couple of those sentences, which provides feedback and shows that you read what the student wrote. Students love it when they know you've read what they've written, okay? And with all of you, I, for the most part, try to let you know I've read what you've written. I interact with it. I pull something out that I find interesting or I'm curious about, and I respond to it. And people like to know that what they thought about and what they expressed is being heard, right? That's just human nature. And so using a sentence starter like this allows students to know that you are reading what they're saying, and it's getting you thinking. Teach students to read and comment on one another's writing constructively. Now, this is a challenge, and I'm going to kind of present you with a model called the RISE model. There are a lot of models out there for how to teach students to read each other's work and not just say, well, that's good, or I like that, right? So it takes time. If you want your students to constructively comment, to give meaningful feedback on each other's writing, you're going to have to teach them how to do that. It doesn't come naturally. And so something like teaching them the RISE model might be something you might be interested in doing. All right, but we're going to go back to that in a minute. What I do want to share with you is a document that I put together that's based on your teaching, reading, and the content areas on your book, right, on this. And I'm going to click on this so that you can see it in a larger format, but this is in your session materials. And I took all of the writing to learn strategies out of this book and wrote them on this piece of paper, okay? And what page number you will find this strategy on in your book, all right? So those are available. This is available for you to print out. It's available in your session materials. But you can see that there are a lot of writing strategies. Some of them are for pre-reading, like pre-reading predictions. Some of them are, you know, as you're reading through the reading. Some of them are reflective type writing assignments. So they're not all the same, and not all of them can be used exactly the same. But there are a lot of strategies here. You'll see learning log right here that we just talked about. Although what I gave you was not obviously from our book. It's a different description of learning log. All right, there's our raft that we talked about. So lots of different options here. Okay. Some of them we've already looked at. Graphic organizers, SQ3R or SQRQ, this one here that I mentioned that math teachers might like. KNFS chart, we've already looked at that for math particularly, but there's, you know, there are quite a few here that you should already be familiar with. All right, but these all are connected to the book that you have here for the class. All right. Okay, let me get back into the slide deck. Okay. All right, so now I'm going to do kind of a mini little lesson on teaching writing. How do you help your students with writing? So this is taking the low stakes writing and kind of amping it up a little bit, so that because I'm not saying that the larger writing assignments aren't valuable. They absolutely are, but they're not something that your students are going to be engaged in every single day. Okay. So the low stakes writing is something that they should be engaged in all the time. This sort of using the writing process is for a larger, you know, kind of a more summative assessment piece of writing. All right. So I have this graphic here that really shows from pre-writing to drafting to editing to publishing. And we're going to go over each part, and I'm going to give you some examples and some ideas of how to teach this. All right. So I think the first thing that students need to understand is that writing is a process. So it is not a linear process. It's flexible. And they're going to go back and forth between these different parts of the writing process. And that's, again, something that takes some teaching and modeling for students, because some of them have been sort of trained to what I write down is what I turn in, and there's not really any steps in between. All right. So it's up to us to teach them really explicitly what each of these steps is, why it's important, and how to do it. All right. So the components include planning, drafting, sharing, evaluating, and notice that sharing, evaluating. So this can happen. They can share it with you. They can share it with a peer. They get feedback. So when we say evaluating, they're getting feedback, because that feedback is evaluative. They revise based on that feedback, they edit, and finally they publish the final product. And we'll talk about what that publishing might look like. Okay. So for planning or for pre-writing, and the pre-writing this is where our low stakes writing comes in. So we're just kind of gathering information, generating ideas, organizing ideas. So here's some different pre-writing techniques. Brainstorming, I think we're all familiar with this. Discussing, now this can be done in writing, like the written conversation type of thing, or it could be done orally. Free writing, we're familiar with that too. I'm assuming that somebody gives you a subject and you take 3 minutes and you write whatever comes to your mind, right? It's a brain dump, free writing. Now, looping is something that I think a lot of people are not familiar with, but this is really pretty effective, where you have a free write, and you take the free write and you pick out a sentence or two from the free write, and then you free write on that sentence or two, and then you do it again. So you can loop as many times as possible, but as many times as you want to. I wouldn't say do it any more than 3 times for students, but it takes them deeper. It takes them, in a different direction potentially. So looping can be an interesting endeavor. Listing, outlining, charting, mapping. We're all pretty familiar with this. Charting, mapping, kind of graphic organizer type things, listing, bullets, right? Outlining. Okay. So pre-writing is really important. And you might help students with that if they're writing an essay or some larger piece of writing. When it comes to outlining, you might have created some sort of a template for them so that they can have their, topic sentence. What are they going to, they can write their topic sentence down. What piece of evidence are they going to cite? They just write that down. And then, and they do that for their different body paragraphs, let's say, so that at least they have this beginning of, they have this outline, something to write to. They know where they're headed. And it allows you to take a quick look and see if they're, kind of staying on topic, so to speak. All right. All right. The drafting process, where they begin writing, selecting words and sentences to get their ideas on the paper. And again, I would recommend that you share this with your students, all right? And that drafting involves risk taking. And sometimes it's hard to get started for all of us. That blank piece of paper, whether it's a Google Doc staring at you on your screen, or it's a blank piece of binder paper, it's sometimes it's difficult to get going. Talk to students about the need to write in a quiet place, or to put on music that has no words. That's important, because they need to be able to kind of go to a place where they can really hear their thoughts and not be distracted. When you're drafting, don't worry about your spelling or grammar. Just get your ideas down. And I've watched so many students who just kind of get jammed up on that, who'll ask me, well, how do you spell this word? I'm like, just write it down however you think. We'll go back and we'll deal with that. You don't want students to get bogged down and make the writing more difficult, or for an idea that's really like, oh, that's great. If they get sidetracked on trying to figure out how to spell a word, they might lose that idea. So get them to just write it down however it comes out the first time. You might encourage students to write on every other line if they're doing it on binder paper, or on just one side of the paper, so that they can have room to correct spelling or grammar or make notes and that kind of thing. And I want to kind of speak to this right now, thinking about AI and students' use of it. You may be experiencing or hearing your colleagues talk about students who are using AI in less than with less than academic integrity. They're having the computer write their papers, write their responses. And this is real. And one of the ways we get around this is to have them drafting, on paper, in handwriting it out, so that there's sort of a breadcrumbs, if you will, a trail of evidence that it came out of their head and onto the paper, and not some computer generated response. Okay. And I'll tell you, if your students are strong writers, if you're dealing with, honors level students, it is virtually impossible to be sure that, that the computer wrote it, and they didn't in some cases. So we have to be careful. And as far as I know, we don't yet have any sort of surefire way to check that this was not student generated. Hopefully that will change soon, but you may want them to be beginning their writing and their drafting, in class, on paper, so that you can just be monitoring that it's their own work. And along with that, and I don't want to go off on a huge rabbit hole on this, but I think it's also really important to talk to students about how you value what they think. You value their ideas, not some computer generated. You don't care what the computer thinks. You want to know what they think, and that they themselves should value their thinking. So it becomes important for us to build their confidence, to listen to them in a way that makes them feel like what they have to say matters, is important, and that we really are seeking that. We're not seeking perfection, and we're seeking them and their original thoughts. So I think it's an important conversation to have with students. And then if they're drafting, have them date or number the draft to show how those drafts have improved and changed from one draft to another. One thing I used to do with my students is I would share with them professional writers, and looking at drafts of professional writers, and looking at the changes that they made as they're writing. And why do you think they chose that word instead of this word? Why did they change that sentence? Why did they? And so we talk a little bit about that, and to actually see famous writers working, their drafting process. I don't know, it's humbling. You realize that, gosh, if Toni Morrison's doing it, or F. Scott Fitzgerald's doing it, or Ernest Hemingway's doing it, I guess I probably need to do it too, right? So you can, they're out there where you can show students that and kind of go over that. So it makes drafting a process that we all are a part of, and there's a reason, because it's going to get better if we do another, if we work on it. All right, then this part about sharing or peer review. Sharing is when writers show or read their ideas to each other throughout the writing process. So not just when it's done, maybe when they're done with their first paragraph, or or they've got their first ideas down in a free write. It enables students to get feedback and suggestions for improving their writing. So this is important, that our students are able to give feedback, to give feedback that will help improve their peers' writing. If you don't think that's going to happen, if that's not something that has been built into the class, then I wouldn't bother with it, because then it's really literally the blind leading the blind. So it's not going to be helpful. Hearing, oh, that's good, doesn't help anybody. So in a minute, we're going to talk about this RISE model, and I invite you to share this with students or something like it, so you teach them how to give feedback that is actionable, that will help improve their friends' writing, their classmates' writing. So writers seek response from peers and the teacher to guide choices in revision. Writers evaluate the response and make appropriate revision choices. Writers read or listen to the writing of others and offer suggestions, share techniques and strategies, and encourage the writers. Okay. I also, this might be a time when I can talk about whether you read rough drafts or not. How much feedback do you give students, right? I can just share with you what I used to do. I would be more than happy to read rough drafts from students if they wanted to offer them to me. And I would look at a rough draft over and over and over if that's what the student wanted to do. My one rule was I will not look at a rough draft the day before the paper's due if I haven't seen it before. You know, I also did not collect all the rough drafts and then give feedback and pass them back. I felt like if a student wasn't kind of seeking that out, then they didn't necessarily want it. And I didn't want to end up having to read a full class of, you know, kind of garbage because they weren't really invested. I don't know if that makes sense, but you know, I wanted them to give me the best that they could for the final product, obviously, right? And the final product was the final product. But I did find that allowing students to do the drafting and those kids that were really motivated to do, you know, to do the best that they could, they would bring me rough drafts. And especially if they felt like it made their writing better. And that I gave them actionable, really clear feedback that they could go and do and revise, and that it would you know, make a difference on the bottom line, if you know, in a way, right? Make a difference in their grade at the end because they'd have a better piece of writing. So those are just some, you know, things that I'm sharing with you. There are lots of teachers out there that do things differently than I. And, you know, you have to find your own way. And again, I'm speaking as an English teacher here, but anyway, that's the way I handled it. But I think the peer review was helpful. I would have my students before we, the day before, or, you know, we were on a every other day schedule. So the class before the final paper was due, we would do a read around. I'd have students bring in their papers, what they had so far, and get feedback from peers. So, and in my classes, the kids realized if they didn't come in with something, they weren't going to get any feedback from their peers, and they often appreciated getting some of that because it helped them. All right. But even if they weren't prepared, they're reading other people's papers who are prepared. And I feel like that kind of, you know, that sort of set the bar for them too, so they could see what other people were doing. Okay. So evaluating can be carried out by the teachers or peers who provide feedback, or by the writers themselves. I mean, ultimately, that's what you hope, is they can be their own best evaluators. But a lot of times that's not the case. And even professional writers, that's not the case, right? They have a lot of people read their writing and give feedback. So, but we do hope that there at least writers can proofread their own pieces. Although F. Scott Fitzgerald couldn't either; he needed an editor. All right. So the RISE model handout. This is the RISE model for giving meaningful feedback. And here's the handout. I'll just kind of open this up so you can see it. So this is in your materials that you could give to students. So, and you know, kind of talk through this, and then on this next slide, let's see, let me get here. We have a video that you could show students. It's not great. And again, there are lots of YouTube videos out there that talk about giving feedback that is meaningful. So this is just one example. All right.
Because we live in a world saturated by media produced independently by everyday people, being able to critically analyze what we watch and hear and engage in meaningful dialogue about that media is an important skill to develop in the 21st century. In this short video, we will review the RISE model for providing meaningful feedback developed by Emily Ray at Full Sail University. The RISE model is a framework for structuring your comments that helps create a dialogue between media producer and media consumer in which both parties can learn from each other and elevate everyone's skill level and knowledge. RISE stands for Reflect, Inquire, Suggest, and Elevate. In this class, you must include all 4 parts of the RISE model in your comments for a peer review to be considered complete. So let's take a look at what each part means. Step 1 is to reflect. This means to recall, ponder, and communicate what you saw or heard. Some examples could be the following. I relate, concur, or disagree with X because of Y. Or, I like what you did with X because of X, Y, and Z. The word because is the key term here. It doesn't just work to say I liked it or it was good. Ultimately, these are meaningless statements because the content producer hasn't learned specifically what they did to make you like it, and you as the viewer haven't learned what it was you liked about it either. So remember to use because and elaborate. Step 2 is inquire. This means to seek information and or provide ideas through questioning. For example, have you considered looking at X from Y perspective? Or, when you said X, am I understanding you to mean XY? Inquiry lets the content producer know that you were paying close enough attention to their work that something didn't quite sit right, or you are curious to learn more. Step 3 is suggest. This means to introduce ideas for improvement of the current iteration of the project. For example, you might say, you might consider tweaking X for Y effect, or you might want to include supporting information from X resource. Here's a link. Remember, this is only a suggestion about tweaking what they have already created. Finally, you can elevate or provide a suggestion to raise their work to a higher degree or purpose in future iterations. For example, perhaps you can expand this in X capacity to further address Y. Or perhaps you can repurpose X as Y for Z. Here's an example of how it might work. I've been asked to provide feedback on Mrs. Reese's profile video. I navigate to her profile. Copy her URL link and hit Control or Command T to open a new tab. Then Control or Command V to paste it into a new tab and watch the video.
Hola, clase. Bienvenidos.
Now that I have watched the video, I'm going to send her a new message and use the RISE model to provide feedback. I start by reflecting. Mrs. Reese, I noticed that your video is in Spanish. I thought this was a good choice because this is what you teach and is likely how you would talk to your real class in real life. Then I inquire. I noticed the background you chose was a kitchen. Is your real classroom a kitchen too? Then I provide a suggestion based on what she has already created. For example, perhaps you could have added a waving animation to your character when she says, "Hola, clase." Finally, I provide a suggestion to elevate the product to a new level. For example, I didn't hear any information about your teaching background. Perhaps in the future, you could add this in to let your students know more about your qualifications. That's all there is to it. Reflect, inquire, suggest, and elevate. And remember, your feedback will not receive full credit unless it includes all 4 sections. Now it's your turn to try it out.
All right, I apologize that the video is blurry at that, it's blurry and then it gets really blurry at the end, but he was saying everything he was typing. So hopefully that made sense. It was a very simple little example, but I think that it is a beginning, and for students, it is something that's understandable. It doesn't get too much into the weeds, and most students You'll notice that on the handout, let me get here. Oh, it wasn't there. It was in, okay, let me get out of this and go to here because I want you to see this. You notice how it here is aligned with Bloom's taxonomy, right? So as a lot of students can get to this part where they're reflecting and they are saying, I liked this because, or, that kind of thing. Then this gets a little bit more challenging, the inquiring, the suggesting, even more so, and elevating. But at least you can be getting the reflection piece, and students can understand why a student liked something or they were confused by something because, and then there's kind of evidence behind it. Okay. So this is just one model for feedback. There are lots of them out there. But you definitely, the main message around this though, is that you have got to teach your students how to give meaningful feedback. They don't know how to do it unless you've taught them, or they've had a teacher who's gotten into that and taught it. All right, so after, the drafting process, feedback, now we're going to talk about revising. And again, this is also something that we need to teach our students. What does revising mean? And I like this little ARMS acronym, because they get it confused with proofreading, and revising is not proofreading, right? It is making content changes, reorganizing ideas, adding or removing text, refining word choice to clarify or enhance meaning, okay? So the ARMS, where you're adding or you're removing or you're moving or you're substituting, and going over that with students, showing them examples. I was just thinking about this too when I said about finding writers that you can find their drafting process. Again, if you are willing to share your writing with students, and you're writing an assignment, one of the assignments you assign, watching, showing them your writing process, your drafting process, your revising process, and talking about why you made the changes that you did. Again, can be very, very effective. Creating a poster like this is helpful for students, or having a handout like this in their binder where they're really clear on what it means when I say you need to revise your second paragraph. They know what we're talking about. Okay. Editing now has the CUPS acronym, where now we're talking about just, sort of spelling and grammar, capitalization, usage, punctuation, spelling. Again, creating a handout for them or a poster so that they're really clear about how editing is different than revising. And then publishing, typically in a classroom, publishing just means turning it into the teacher, but it can be so much more than that. And it can be something where it's higher stakes than just giving it to the teacher. Publishing can be seeking an authentic audience. They can be trying to get it published in the paper. They can do, on a class website, or in the class paper or the school paper or something along those lines. We had a teacher at Petaluma High who used to have the students writing in, and at the Press Democrat, this had in Santa Rosa, the Press Democrat had a teen page that would periodically, they would publish student writing on the teen page, and we would have students getting published in the Press Democrat. That was a big deal, right? And they were very proud of that, as they should be. And so turning in a piece of writing, publishing it in the Press Democrat versus, turning it in for a grade to the teacher, you can sort of see the difference. So the more you can seek authentic audiences for your students' writing, and having them publishing to those, those audiences is really great. Okay. So we're going to take now a turn, and I want to say this again. I know I've said this early on in session 1, I think. This class, Curriculum 242, contains so much information because of the way the course description was written. I would have pared this down, oh my goodness. But the course description was written the way the course description was written. So bear with me because we still have more. There's still more around the writing. Not that any of this isn't important, but you know, again, we kind of get into the weeds a little bit. So again, bear with me. So we've talked about the writing process, and now we're going to talk about the purpose. And actually, this connects in with your Ed TPA that you'll be doing next year. Because when we talk about purpose, we're talking about language demands. Okay. And we're going to get into that in a lot bigger way in our next session, session 5. And from session 5 to session 10 is we're headed into the preparing for the Ed TPA, giving you an experience with what they're going to ask you to do in the teacher performance assessment, right? And one of the things that you will be identifying and turning in, you know, for your Ed TPA is a language demand. So what do your students have to do with language? What's the purpose for them to be using language in your class? All right. So writing is used for a variety of purposes. We can convey information. We can make an argument. We can provide a means for self-reflection. We can share an experience. It helps us enhance understanding, or it can just provide entertainment. Okay. So this purposes of writing handout that you'll see in your source materials or your session materials, I've created this. You can, again, share this with your students, but these are all language demands to inform. If a student is going to write some paper to inform, it communicates ideas and information to others. And here's some examples of how this might look. Journalistic writing, lab reports are informative, research papers, economic reports, business reports. I'm going to skip the entertaining part. Well, let's go down to the explaining, because that's a big one that we do, where we're gathering facts and combining experience to clarify who or what something is, or how it happened, or why something happened. Okay, so this explaining is called expository writing, and you'll hear that a lot, right, about expository writing. So a definition essay is an example of expository writing, a process piece, cause and effect explanations. Those are examples of expository. And then persuading and arguing are also, I'm going to share with you kind of a handout to teach how to write a persuasive paper. But to persuade, it uses appeals to logic, emotion, and character. So logos, ethos, right? Pathos. An advertisement or debate would be persuasion. Argument is a special kind of persuasion that fairly and accurately appeals to logic, emotion, and character, and uses evidence in stating a point of view. Okay. So that they're defining it here as maybe this could be persuasion is more biased, argumentation, it should be much less biased, trying to not be biased. A problem solution research could be an argument. Evaluation is evaluative as well as another piece of kind of writing that we do quite a bit in schools, evaluating something. Okay. Argues for the merits of the subject, presents evidence to support it. All right. So this is a 1-page handout. What are some of the purposes that we write? Okay. All right. So argumentative writing. Let's get into this. Again, for English teachers, this shouldn't be anything that you don't already know, but I put this together so that you could potentially, you know, I know as brand new teachers, you might be just gathering things to how to teach something. So this kind of gives you an outline for how to teach argumentative writing, what the purpose is, what are the elements of argumentative writing: claim, reasons, evidence, counterclaim. And then we have here like a writing frame, okay? And what I like, and you can take a look at this at your own leisure here, down here to kind of give your students an acronym, the word persuade, and sort of the way a paper is set up. Pull your audience in with an interesting hook in your introduction. Explain your point of view. Reasons will help your audience be persuaded. S is sway your audience. U, use convincing language. A, address possible alternative points of view with reasons to counteract them. So the counter, you know, counter argument. Deliver a strong message that's repeated in the conclusion and entice your readers with proper word choice and sentence structure. So this is a kind of a handout that if you go over it with your students and spend time explaining it, giving examples, this could go in their notebook for them. And the same is true for this informative or explanatory writing. And, you know, these are the different kinds of writing assignments that could be done with informative or explanatory writing. And then you have the acronym INFORM that gives you, you know, kind of prompt students on what exactly is an informative or explanatory piece of writing. It includes an introduction, an opening paragraph. It names facts in the body paragraphs. It follows the facts with supporting sentences, organizes your writing with transition words, refer to the topic and include key vocabulary, and make a closing paragraph that relates to the topic. Okay. So this is just this is also like a one-page deal. Okay. There are lots of, this is just a couple examples. There are lots of things out there to help you to support your students. So, you know, don't feel like you have to use those. Those are not the be all and end all. But the persuasive writing and informative, like persuasive and expository writing, those are the big two that students do in school. All right. And then last but not least, who are they writing to? The audience. So they need to learn to adjust their writing for their intended audience. Now, this might seem like it goes without saying, but students really, the most struggling writers have a really difficult time going into kind of an academic register. They write the way they think, the way they talk. And so it sounds like they're writing a note to a friend. They're using slang. They might be using four-letter words. They don't get it. So it does help to talk to students about who is the audience. It may be the teacher. You may be setting the audience up, a different audience than just you. I once had my students writing to the school board. It was an argumentative paper where they were arguing for the use of cell phones in school, that they should be, you know, free cell phone use in school. And their audience was the school board. So we talked about who those members of the school board was, what they, you know, the tone that they needed to have, that they couldn't be, you know, using four-letter words and bro and words like that. So understanding who your audience is helpful. And for students to understand the role of the audience, how the audience impacts their writing. So if they're writing to third graders, the topic might be the same, but it's going to sound very different than if they're writing to a college professor, right? Same topic, but a different audience. Their word choice is going to be different, that kind of thing. So teachers and students can generate a list of possible audiences for a given writing assignment. Then students can choose the audience that best fits their writing topic. This is very sort of UDL, right? They can practice adjusting their tone and their word choice to suit their audience by writing and rewriting the same piece for different audiences. Now, the raft sets up the audience, doesn't it? So the raft assignment is something where you could tweak that audience and see how it changes. You could keep the R and the F and the T the same, but you change that audience and it's going to impact the writing. So to have students just play with this and see how audience really does change things. And then this idea that we want ultimately our students to have these tools in their toolboxes so that the teacher isn't the one who's having to read the rough drafts and that kind of thing, that we're not having to assign the pre-writing and assign them the proofreading and so on, that they are learning these writing strategies and then they can do these on their own. So again, we have to first make sure that students have the background knowledge and the skills needed to use a writing strategy. So we have to directly teach these things. We need to describe how to do it and model its use. So as we're using strategies out of our reading in the content area kind of thing, we are talking it through. We're saying why it's important. We're modeling its use. So kind of like I do, we do, you do kind of format, let's say, with something, and then having them, use it again and again so that they get comfortable with it. And we need to describe why students might choose to use the strategy. That again, that kind of goes with the front loading of the strategy. Why would you use this strategy? In what ways might this be helpful? In what contexts might this strategy be helpful? And then, we need to guide them in applying the strategy independently. They need to practice and practice and practice. Using a strategy one time, even though you might have explained it perfectly and showed them how to use it, they use it and they sort of bomb it, and then that's the end. They'll never that tool never go in their toolbox. You need to get them to practice it over and over and over, okay? Giving them multiple opportunities to use a particular strategy so that they become comfortable with it. Okay, so if you need to take a break, again, and of course with this Zoom meeting at any point, you can turn me off and turn it back on. But we're getting there. We're getting to the end, y'all. But what I did want to do is I want to address our questions about writing. Remember, in our first session, we had a variety of Google Forms, or not Google Forms, but a variety of Google Docs that allowed you to ask questions about reading, writing, speaking and listening, and assessment. And so I have rewritten and written the questions that you had about writing. So our first question, and I'm going to just, I want to address these to make sure that you had your question answered as best I can. And if you've got further, questions, please reach out to me, because I'm happy to have a conversation about any and all of these questions. So first question, how do we accommodate students who show significant difficulty when writing more than simple statements, especially when they appear to abhor the act of writing? So how do we get them to write more than simple statements? It really takes practice. That abhorring writing, again, I think comes with feeling judged, feeling like they're not successful. I would have a conversation if they're old enough. I would have a conversation about why they hate writing so much, and maybe it's simply where they need to practice speaking and having like speech to text so that they're not having to write it. Maybe it's the act of actually, mechanically writing it down. If they can use speech to text technology, that might be helpful. It can also be helpful for students to use writing frames and templates so that they, it's a scaffold. That blank piece of paper or that blank Google Doc is not a scaffold, right? So to get them to slowly scaffold them up is helpful, okay? So the accommodation would be, I would say, sentence frames, templates, writing templates, text to speech, and having a conversation about, what is it that they hate about writing. How do we get students to write headings on their assignments? The assignment doesn't count if the heading, I mean, if headings really are that important, and I would say, are they? I would, and I don't mean this in a snarky way. I would say, if it really is that important, if you think that is if that's really a big deal, then make it a big deal. They've got to have the heading on the assignment, or they lose 30% of the points, or whatever it might be. Okay. So I just leave it at that. How do we wean students off of using sentence starters or frames when they no longer need them? And how do we encourage students to begin creating their own? When I first start with my freshmen, when I first start teaching them how to write an essay, although some of them have been writing essays since they were in like 4th grade, I use the analogy of riding a bike. And I say, when you first learn to ride a bicycle, we want you to have both hands on the handlebars. We want both feet on the pedals. We want you looking straight ahead. We want, you're focusing on where you're going, all of those things. And so the sentence starters, the sentence frames, the writing templates, kind of the outlines, these are all like learning to ride a bike. But after a while, after you feel comfortable riding the bike, you can take your hands off the handlebars, you can flip the bike, you watch what people do, right? They have fun with it, and they are not just, gripped onto both handles. We want them to feel kind of a freedom and an ability to take a risk. And I think that, you can up the requirements for students, that it becomes something kind of differentiation, if you will, where some students, you might not pull those, wean them off of those sentence frames. Other students, you're like, okay, we're done with those. I want to hear how you're putting these together. You can begin creating your own. They're going to be better than what you've been using. And they sound kind of mechanical. So your voice matters, your tone. Give it a shot, and then reward them for that risk, so that they, that you got to reward them for the risk, even if it's not maybe as good, but at least they start to gain a confidence that, hey, they can do this on their own. All right. How do we get students to reread and revise their own writing? One of the things that I was taught to do and have done, and I found it really successful, but it's a lot of work on the front end, is the first time students turn in a final draft paper, you go over it with a fine-tooth comb with your pen, and you mark things that are incorrect. And then they have to number each of those items that are incorrect, each of your marks. And on the back side of the paper, they have to say what they did incorrectly, and they have to correct it in the sentence or sentences. Okay. It's onerous. It's time consuming. And they are much more likely, and you don't record their grade until they return in their paper with their mistakes corrected and an explanation of why it was incorrect. Again, it's a slog the first couple of times, and then kids get to the point like they don't want to do that, and they start to reread and revise because they know you're going to go over their, but you go really hard the first couple papers, the first couple final draft papers, and that will reduce a lot of the sloppy, where like, you didn't even spell check this, right? Okay, how do we help students improve their writing, even when we spend weeks going through an essay step by step? I guess I'm not quite sure how to answer this. If they're not hearing what you're saying, if you feel like that going through an essay step by step, the other piece is the first time you teach an essay, and again, I would do this with my freshmen, I would just have them, we would talk about the introduction paragraph. They would write an introduction paragraph to their essay, and I would collect it. And I would give them feedback on it, and then it would go back in, and then we would do that with one body paragraph, and we would do that with the conclusion paragraph. And then they had to write the other two body paragraphs, on their own without my feedback, unless they sought it out, as I had said earlier. So I first really directly gave them major feedback as we went through the pieces of it. So that might be, because just going over something step by step, unless you're giving them individual feedback, and maybe you are, I don't know, but that would be my advice on that one. You've got to be able to give them individual feedback. But okay. How much writing is too much for Spanish 1 Heritage course? I do not feel like I make them write too much, but they always complain. Kids complain, right? And I'm sure if you feel like they're not writing, that you're not making them writing too much, then you're not. Just explain to them why you're having them write so much, because writing and language are, inextricably linked, and being bilingual is important, but being biliterate is, just as important. So you're focusing on that biliteracy, right? So how do we support a student in reading and writing who's clearly grade levels below their classmates? I would say, again, it's like the sentence starters, the sentence frames, and with some of the things that are to read, like Newsela or Newsela, where you can have, and actually there are quite a few different programs out there that'll take a text and then lower the reading level down, so the student's getting the same content but easier reading level. But it is difficult, and we've had those kids in even high school classes that are reading right at 4th grade level, and what do we do with that? And maybe reaching out, if they're reading and writing way below grade level, I'm going to assume they're probably special education students as well. Reaching out to their SPED teacher and seeing in what ways can that education specialist support them and support you in helping the student. So, kind of pre-teaching and giving them as many sort of support materials as possible. How do we get students to look over their notes and rewrite them in their own words? I think really they have to feel that doing that is beneficial in some way. So how do you sweeten the pot? How do you make it worth their while? They have to feel like in some way it's going to make their score on their tests better, or you could give them, grades on their notes when they've rewritten them in their own words. Or you could do something like that science journal that we saw, where they have the notes on one side of the page and they have to rewrite them in their own words, and you're checking each time. And if they're not doing it, then they're not getting the credit. And it's a whole different conversation for kids who don't care if they fail. I don't want to go down that rabbit hole right now. Like I said, that's a whole nother conversation. And it's something that I deal with all the time in alt ed, because they have failed and failed and failed, but there's another approach to, it's different. So, I would have them, practicing it on the daily, let's say that. And again, rewarding them for it, giving them credit for it. How do we get students out of the habit of using the simplest terms possible or unnecessary shorthand? For example, this picture has a man, the man has a dog, there is a man with a dog in this picture. I would say for some of them, just saying that this is not okay. You need to rewrite this. Or for those who kind of give you this blank stare, like, I don't really know what you mean, then teach sentence combining. Teach them how to write juicy sentences, how to take that and then create a bigger sentence. You know, a compound, complex sentence. Teach that. And another thing you could say is each sentence needs to have at least 7 words. It needs to be 7 words long. That's one of the things I say to my kids. Although that's a short sentence, really, 7 words, but it keeps them from, you know, see, spot, run, go, dog, go sentences. So I think expressing your expectations, following through with that, showing them what you mean by that, those that are struggling with writing longer sentences, more complex sentences, showing them what that looks like. How can we support ELLs while taking notes? I think having, you know, giving them kind of fill in the blank type notes would be one thing where they're just trying to listen for certain information. You could have them, depending on if they are literate in their mother tongue, having them write their notes in their hearing it and then writing it in their L1 and then translating it over, kind of like the question about rewriting notes in their own words, where they're rewriting them in English, although that's pretty onerous. It takes a lot of time. You could, so I kind of like the idea of kind of creating these sentence frame notes. That's helpful for our special education students too, who have audio processing issues, to have them, auditory processing issues, to have them already kind of framed out, so they're listening for certain things. Okay. So those are some ideas. How can we help improve a student's terrible handwriting? Is taking away points for illegibility allowed? So this is a struggle because kids are really not, especially our COVID kiddos, right? They are not learning they were not, you know, in school really learning. Also, I will say that I have heard, I'm not an elementary school teacher, but because there is so much focus on, you know, reading and writing so young, TK, kindergarten, the kids are not getting a lot of work with Play-Doh and things that help them with ultimately with their fine motor skills. It's like we're putting a pencil in their hand and off they go, and they're not ready. They're not getting their pencil grip proper. There's a whole lot of things that go along with that. So you have to kind of think, all right, is this a battle we want to take on when they're in junior high, high school? Is it easier to just have them typing things out, you know, word processing? Or do we just teach them how to write all capital letters? I mean, I think about, you know, my wife's a cop, and they have to write everything in all caps. And so everybody writes it the same way because that's the most legible, is to write in all caps. And then, you know, the capital letters are just bigger capital letters than the lowercase, but they're all, you know, block handwritten letters. You know, asking a student to write that way. So I think having handwriting that is legible is important. I think having a conversation with students about why that's important. They're going to have to, certain things have to be handwritten and it has to be legible. So this is why, and then giving them, you know, something other than cursive or handwriting to do for those kids that just, it's too far gone at that point, right? And then some students really, you know, again, check their IEP. Some students have dysgraphia, like they cannot handwrite they cannot write on 2 lines or on a line, you know what I mean? Like between 2 lines. It's just, they can't do it. So we need to make adjustments for that. All right. Okay, how can we get students to cover all the prompts that are required for conclusion paragraph for a lab? Directions are written explicitly above the paragraph. Okay, I would say a model. You go over the model, you show them how to do it, that whole thing, and then for a lab, and I think this was Max, I think maybe this was you in chem, then you slam them. You know, if they haven't done it the way that you've given them a model, they've seen what it is, you've covered how to do it, the whole thing, and now they're not going to do the prompts, then they lose points. And for kids that are, you know, college bound, the grade speaks volumes, right? And sometimes they're not going to pay attention until they get a D, and all of a sudden they're like, "Whoa!" And maybe you say, "Okay, this is a D. You can rewrite it. I'll give you one chance to redo this, and I never want to see this again," kind of a thing. But you know, sometimes you got to come down with the big hammer, but only after you have given them, you know, you've modeled it for them. They've seen what it is. They've, you know, all of that. All right. Okay. So hopefully that answered questions. If you have any further, again, reach out. There is a formative assessment in Canvas. I'm going to just click on this so you can see this isn't in Canvas, obviously, but this is what it is. We've covered a great deal of information tonight. Yes, we have. I want to give you a chance to reflect on your learning and to think about how you might incorporate some of what we talked about in your own classes and teaching practice. So what was an aha for you? What strategy resonated with you? How might you use this in your class? And in a brief paragraph, respond to your raft assignment as if you were a student, okay? So you were the teacher who wrote the raft assignment early on when we took that first, you know, little shut the Zoom off and write it out. And now you're the student. You're going to answer it as if you were a student in a brief paragraph, okay? And add to your literacy strategy log. You can add the raft. Sorry about that. Hang on one second. All right, sorry. You at raft, the learning log, and the written conversation are all in your log. So add those to your log. And then for our next class, we will, I'd like you to bring, not bring, because it'll be on Zoom, but have handy your textbook that you use for your class, or some reading material that you're going to have your students read, okay? So like I have here math, you know, student handbook for math. Here's obviously science. It could be, but more, well, it actually could be narrative text. So it could be from a novel. We're just going to kind of get in. Hopefully we'll have time to do this next class. Get in and take a look at what exactly are the this language demands of our reading. Like what are we asking our students to be able to do? What's the syntax level of our text? Like how demanding is it? Okay. All right, so what's due by our next class is, and our next class is, let me see, what is that? December. I have my calendar here. I see you guys again on December 16th, and then we have a couple weeks off for winter break. So get your formative assessment done, and I really appreciate you hanging out with me through this Zoom asynchronous session. We'll see you there. I just needed to go to the next slide, didn't I? So see you Monday, December 16th via Zoom. And this session is the biggie, really. If there's one session that I think is the most important session as it pertains to your EdTPA for next year, your ability to get a preliminary teacher credential, this is the one, because we're going to be talking about the academic language demands, and that goes specifically to what you're going to be doing in part on the EdTPA. Okay, so I hope you all have a great rest of your week, and I will see you in our next Zoom session. All right.